The kitchen had become her confessional, not the kind where sins are whispered and absolution flows freely, but something darker, a place where Sister Maria Antonyina measured her faith in spoonfuls of broth and her conscience in the faces of men who had forgotten what conscience meant. She was 52 years old in March 1945, though she looked older. The occupation had carved lines into her face that prayer could not smooth. Her hands, once soft from years of contemplation, had grown rough from scrubbing floors muddied by German boots, from peeling potatoes for mouths that spoke of horrors between bites. The convent of the Sacred Heart had stood in Posen for over 2 centuries. Generations of women had walked its stone corridors, their footsteps echoing against walls that witnessed empires rise and crumble. But nothing in those 200 years had prepared it for September 1939. Maria remembered the day the Germans arrived. She had been harvesting tomatoes when she heard the rumble of engines. At first she thought it was thunder, but the sound grew closer, and when she looked up, she saw them. Trucks painted gray-green, spilling soldiers into streets that had known nothing but farmers and merchants for generations. The convent was requisitioned within a week. Most sisters were relocated to a cramped farmhouse in the countryside, but 5 nuns were ordered to remain. Maria was among them. The transformation happened gradually, then all at once. First came ordinary Wehrmacht troops who treated the building with something approaching respect. Some even attended Mass secretly, young men remembering prayers their mothers taught them. But the Wehrmacht moved on, replaced by something far worse. The SS arrived in autumn 1941. These were not ordinary soldiers. Maria understood immediately, could see it in their precision, in the emptiness behind their eyes. They wore uniforms like armor, death's head insignias grinning from their caps. The convent became a rest facility, where officers rotating off the Eastern Front could recover before returning to conquest. Maria cooked their meals. She heard about villages burned to ash, inhabitants herded into barns and incinerated. She heard about mass graves dug by the people who would fill them. She heard about the camps, factories of death processing human beings like raw materials. And through it all, she stirred soup and said nothing. She became invisible. The officers rarely looked at her directly. To them she was furniture, a necessary inconvenience. They spoke freely in her presence, confident the old nun posed no threat. They were wrong. Maria had an excellent memory. Before her vows, she had been a school teacher. She remembered names, dates, which officers participated in which operations. She built a mental archive of atrocities growing longer each month. 5 years passed in this purgatory. Maria watched her fellow sisters age before their time. Sister Agnes stopped speaking after watching an officer beat a prisoner in the courtyard. Sister Catherine simply disappeared one night. When Maria asked what happened, an officer smiled and said she had been reassigned. By January 1945, the war had turned against Germany. The Red Army advanced from the east, the Allies from the west. But the officers seemed oblivious, holding elaborate dinners, drinking requisitioned wine, talking about victory, as if it were still possible. The winter was brutal. Snow buried the grounds for weeks. And during that frozen hell, Maria's hatred crystallized. It happened on a January afternoon so cold her breath froze on her eyelashes. She was crossing the courtyard when she heard commotion at the gate. A column of prisoners was being marched past, skeletal figures in striped uniforms shuffling through snow that reached their knees. Then one collapsed. A young woman, barely 20, crumpling into the snow. A guard walked over, considered her for a moment, then drew his pistol and fired into her skull. The sound echoed off the convent walls. The guard holstered his weapon and rejoined the column without breaking stride. The woman's body remained in the snow, blood freezing into crimson ice. Maria watched everything. She watched until an officer asked what she was staring at. She returned to the kitchen and finished preparing dinner with steady hands and blank expression. But something had shattered inside her. That night, she made a decision. She could not continue feeding monsters while innocents died in the snow. She could not stand before God and explain she had done nothing because doing something was dangerous. For 5 years she had obeyed another commandment without realizing it. Thou shalt not stand idly by while thy neighbor's blood is shed. But she had stood idly by. She had watched and listened while her countrymen were systematically exterminated. The officers would not face justice when the war ended. They would slip into the chaos of defeat, change names, hide pasts, live as respectable citizens in South America, or quiet German villages. They would escape unless someone stopped them. Maria could be that someone. She thought of Judith from Scripture, the widow who beheaded the Assyrian general to save her people. The church venerated Judith as a heroine. Was Maria's situation different? These officers had killed far more than Holofernes ever had. She began observing the convent with new eyes. Where before she moved like a sleepwalker, now she studied every routine, every vulnerability, and she discovered the perfect opportunity. Every Sunday at noon, all 50 officers gathered in the dining hall for communal lunch. Attendance was mandatory. The meal always began with soup served in large tureens that Maria prepared alone, without supervision. What harm could an old nun do with vegetables and broth? She was about to show them. The decision to kill was not born from rage. Rage is hot, impulsive, fleeting. What grew inside Maria was colder, more deliberate. 5 years of witnessed horror crystallized into unshakable purpose. She needed poison, something lethal but not immediately obvious, allowing every officer to consume a full portion before symptoms appeared. If one man suspected foul play before finishing his bowl, he would alert the others. The answer had been in the convent basement all along. Rat poison, arsenic trioxide, a fine white powder that dissolved readily in liquid and left no obvious taste when properly diluted. Maria had used it for years, protecting grain stores from rodents. She knew its properties, knew how much killed a rat, and could estimate how much would kill a man. The mathematics were grim, but straightforward. A lethal dose for an adult was approximately 100 milligrams. The Sunday soup filled a massive iron pot holding 50 liters. If she dissolved enough poison to provide 3 grams per serving, the results would be catastrophic. She gathered arsenic slowly over weeks, removing small amounts that escaped notice. A few grams here, a few there, accumulated in a glass vial hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her quarters. The vial grew heavier, and so did her conscience. She was planning murder. No other word existed for it. She could dress it in language of justice or divine retribution, but the reality remained. She intended to take human lives. Thou shalt not kill admitted no exceptions for enemy soldiers, no caveats for men who committed atrocities. Maria wrestled with this through sleepless nights. She argued with herself, with God, with the ghost of every innocent she had watched die. She searched scriptures for guidance, and found it in Judith, the widow who seduced the Assyrian general and cut off his head. The church venerated her as a heroine who saved her people through calculated violence. The officers had killed far more than Holofernes. By any measure of divine justice, their lives were forfeit. Final confirmation came one February evening. 2 officers were drinking in the parlor, speaking loosely. Maria washed dishes in the next room, invisible as always. They discussed reassignments. The war was ending, they acknowledged. One had orders for Bavaria, an administrative posting far from advancing armies. But it was what came next that sealed Maria's resolve. The first officer laughed about peacetime. He had connections, friends in the church who could provide documentation and new identity. Within a year, he expected to live comfortably in South America on fortune accumulated during service. The second agreed. The important thing was destroying inconvenient records. Witnesses could be dealt with easily, but paperwork survived. He had already begun burning documents. Maria's hands trembled. These men were not worried about punishment. They calmly planned escape, confident their crimes would never catch them. And they were probably right. Germany's collapse would provide perfect cover. Allied forces would be overwhelmed with millions of refugees. They could not track every SS officer, unless someone ensured justice for them. Maria would act on the second Sunday of March. She would prepare soup as always, with fresh vegetables and rich broth, and the secret ingredient transforming a meal into an execution. Escape presented the greater challenge. The convent was under constant surveillance, guards at every entrance, patrols circling at irregular intervals. The answer came from her knowledge of the building. Maria had lived here over 2 decades. She knew its secrets. The drainage tunnel in the basement, built centuries ago to prevent flooding, extended beyond the convent walls, emerging in a ditch on the far side of the property. She inspected it one night. The tunnel was choked with debris and slick with mold, but passable. Barely. She would crawl through absolute darkness, trusting it had not collapsed entirely. She assembled an escape kit slowly, civilian clothes stolen from confiscated belongings, a forged identity card from a resistance contact who delivered supplies disguised as a farmer, Polish currency, a hand-drawn map showing routes west toward Allied lines. She hid everything beneath the same floorboard concealing the poison. And she prayed, not for forgiveness. That would come later if she survived. She prayed only for strength to carry out what she had committed herself to do. The second Sunday of March arrived with unexpected warmth. Snow began melting, turning the courtyard into mud. Maria woke before dawn, the air charged with possibility and danger. She dressed in her habit for the last time. She retrieved the vial and tucked it into a cloth pouch tied around her waist beneath her garment. The glass was cool against her skin. Then she descended to the kitchen. The soup would be her masterpiece. Maria descended the stone staircase into the kitchen at 5 in the morning. The room was dark, illuminated only by faint gray light filtering through a single high window. She lit oil lamps one by one, their flames casting long shadows across worn wooden counters. The kitchen smelled of onions and damp stone. She moved through the space with deliberate calm, retrieving ingredients from the pantry. Carrots, potatoes, celery, onions, parsley, vegetable stock. Everything ordinary, everything routine. She filled the massive iron pot with water and set it on the stove. As the water heated, she began chopping vegetables with mechanical precision. Her knife moved in steady rhythms. Chop, chop, chop. She had made this soup hundreds of times. Her body knew the motions by heart. But today her mind was elsewhere. Today she was preparing the last meal 50 men would ever eat. The morning hours passed slowly. Maria worked in solitude, grateful that the other sisters had been assigned different duties. She needed to be alone for what came next. No witnesses, no complications. By 9 o'clock, the soup was nearly complete. Vegetables had softened into tender submission. The broth had thickened into rich golden liquid, filling the kitchen with comforting aroma. It looked perfect. It smelled perfect. She sampled a spoonful from the top, ensuring the flavor was balanced. Now came the moment she had been dreading. She reached into her habit and retrieved the small glass vial. Inside was fine white powder, arsenic trioxide. She had measured it carefully the night before using an old apothecary scale from the infirmary. Too little, and officers would merely become ill. Too much and the poison might leave detectable taste. She had calculated dosage based on volume of soup and number of men consuming it. Each officer would receive approximately 3 grams, more than enough to be lethal. Her hand shook as she unscrewed the vial. She paused, staring at the white powder. This was the point of no return. Once poison entered the soup, there would be no undoing what she was about to do. She thought about her vows, about the commandment she was violating. Thou shalt not kill. Then she thought about the young woman in the snow, the villages burned to ash, the children who would never grow old, the mass graves, the camps, 5 years of horror witnessed in silence. She poured the poison into the soup. The powder dissolved instantly, vanishing into golden broth without trace. She stirred slowly, ensuring even distribution, then stepped back, crossed herself, and whispered a prayer, not for forgiveness, for strength. The next 2 hours stretched like eternity. Maria cleaned the kitchen, scrubbed already clean counters, checked and rechecked the soup. She listened to sounds from above, boots on stone floors, voices in corridors, the building coming alive as officers began their Sunday routines. At 11:30, she heard them gathering in the dining hall, boots echoing, voices loud and jovial. They were in good spirits. Rumors had spread that the war would end soon. Many believed they would receive cushy administrative posts in Berlin. They had no idea that in 30 minutes they would be dying. Maria ladled soup into porcelain tureens, her face a mask of serene calm. She carried them into the dining hall on a wooden cart, setting them on the long oak table, where officers sat shoulder to shoulder in pristine black uniforms, medals glinting in afternoon light. They barely acknowledged her presence. To them she was just the old nun, the invisible servant. One officer waved impatiently, signaling her to hurry. Another made a crude joke about the soup being the only good thing about this godforsaken convent. Laughter rippled around the table. Maria said nothing. She bowed her head and returned to the kitchen, and waited. She stood in the doorway, hidden in shadows, watching through a narrow crack. The dining hall was alive with noise. Laughter echoed off high stone walls. Silverware clinked against porcelain. Wine glasses raised in toasts to the fatherland, to victory, to survival. The soup was served in waves. The first tureen emptied within minutes. Officers praised the flavor, calling it the best batch she had ever made. One young lieutenant, barely 25, asked for a second bowl, then a third. Maria felt something she could not name. Was it guilt, regret, or simply recognition that this young man, who might have been someone's son or brother, had chosen to wear the uniform of monsters? He had made his choice, and now so had she. The officers continued eating, oblivious to fate coursing through their bloodstreams. Arsenic works slowly, methodically, attacking the digestive system first, then spreading to kidneys, liver, heart. First symptoms can take 30 minutes to 2 hours. Maria had timed everything perfectly. By the time they realized something was wrong, it would be far too late. At 12:45, the first officer began to feel ill. It was the young lieutenant who had eaten 3 bowls. He stood abruptly from the table, face pale, hand pressed against his stomach. He muttered something about needing air and stumbled toward the door. The other officers barely noticed. They were absorbed in conversations, in their own meals, in their sense of invincibility. But within 10 minutes, another officer stood, then another, then 3 more. The dining hall, which had been loud and chaotic moments before, began to quiet. Laughter faded. Toasts stopped. Officers looked at each other with confusion, then concern, then fear. Something was very wrong. One officer vomited violently onto the floor. Another collapsed against the wall, clutching his chest. A third knocked over his chair trying to reach the door, his legs giving out beneath him. Panic spread like wildfire through the room. Voices rose in alarm. Someone shouted for a medic. Someone else screamed that they had been poisoned. The word echoed off stone walls, finally naming the horror that was consuming them from within. Maria retreated deeper into the kitchen, her back pressed against cold stone. She could hear the chaos unfolding. The screams, the retching, the sound of bodies hitting the floor, the desperate pleas for help that would never come. She closed her eyes and prayed, not for the officers, for herself. She prayed that God would understand, that this unforgivable sin would somehow be weighed against the lives she had saved, because she was not just killing 50 SS officers, she was preventing 50 future atrocities. These men, if allowed to survive, would have melted into German society, changed names, hidden pasts, lived as shopkeepers, teachers, bureaucrats. They would have escaped justice entirely. That, Maria believed, was the greater sin. By 1:15, the dining hall had descended into complete pandemonium. Officers sprawled across the floor, convulsing, vomiting blood, gasping for air. The few still conscious tried helping comrades, but they too were succumbing. Medical personnel arrived but could do nothing. Arsenic poisoning has no antidote. The damage was irreversible. Maria knew she could not stay to witness the end. Every minute she remained increased the chance of discovery. The other sisters would soon be questioned. The entire convent would be searched. She had to move now. She slipped out the kitchen's back entrance into the courtyard. The afternoon sun was warm on her face, almost mockingly pleasant. Birds sang in trees that had survived 6 years of occupation. The world continued as if nothing had happened, but everything had changed. Maria moved quickly toward the side of the building, staying close to walls, avoiding open spaces where she might be spotted. Guards were stationed at the main gate, but they had not yet been alerted. The screaming from inside had not reached them over the distance. She had minutes at most. She reached the cellar entrance, a heavy wooden door set into the foundation that few people remembered existed. Her hands trembled as she lifted the iron latch. The hinges groaned in protest and she froze, certain someone had heard. Nothing. No shouts. No footsteps. She descended into darkness. The cellar smelled of mold and forgotten things. Maria navigated by memory, her hands trailing along damp walls until she reached the far corner. Old wooden crates and barrels were stacked against the stone. Behind them was the entrance to the drainage tunnel. She pulled the crates aside, revealing a narrow opening barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. The air that rushed out was foul, thick with mildew and rot. Maria did not hesitate. She dropped to hands and knees and crawled into the darkness. The tunnel seemed to stretch forever. Walls were slick with moisture and algae. Jagged stones tore at her dress and scraped her knees. She could hear water dripping somewhere in the distance. echoing in the confined space. Her breath came in short gasps. The tunnel was so narrow she could not turn around. If it collapsed, if it dead-ended, she would be trapped. But she kept moving forward, inch by inch, driven by a single thought: survive. Survive long enough to ensure those 47 deaths meant something. After what felt like eternity, she saw it, a faint circle of daylight ahead, the exit. She crawled faster, ignoring pain in her knees, ignoring blood soaking through her dress. And then she was out. She emerged into a ditch on the far side of the convent grounds, hidden by overgrown bushes and tall grass. She lay there gasping, body trembling, but she did not allow herself to rest. She stood, brushed dirt from her clothes, and began walking north, toward the farmhouse, toward freedom, toward a future she was not sure she deserved. The 3-kilometer journey to the farmhouse should have taken less than an hour, but these were not normal circumstances. Maria was a 52-year-old woman who had spent 3 decades in near-total isolation from the outside world. She had no survival training, no weapons, no experience navigating hostile territory, and the countryside between the convent and the rendezvous point was crawling with German patrols. The roads were too dangerous. She stuck to fields and forests, moving in zigzag patterns to avoid open ground. Her legs ached. Her lungs burned. Every sound made her freeze, convinced she had been discovered. The snap of a twig, the distant bark of a dog, the rumble of a truck engine on the nearby highway. Each sent adrenaline flooding through her body, sharpening senses while threatening to push her into full panic. She had changed out of her habit before entering the tunnel, stuffing civilian clothes into a small bag she carried beneath her robes. Now she wore a plain gray dress and headscarf, the costume of a Polish peasant widow. Her forged identity card identified her as Maria Kowalski, a seamstress from Krakow. It was not much, but it might buy precious seconds if she were stopped. Twice she had to hide. The first time was when a German patrol vehicle passed along a dirt road 50 meters from where she crouched behind a fallen tree. She pressed herself flat against cold mud, barely breathing, as 2 SS soldiers stepped out to relieve themselves. They stood there for what felt like eternity, smoking cigarettes, talking casually. One joked about the poisoning back at the convent, calling it poetic justice for eating nun food. The other laughed. They had no idea the woman responsible was a stone's throw away. After they drove off, Maria remained motionless for 10 more minutes. Only then did she rise and continue. The second time was worse. As she approached a small forest, she heard voices. German voices. Close. She dove into a thicket of bushes, thorns tearing at her skin, and watched as an entire SS unit marched past. At least 20 soldiers, heavily armed, moving with grim determination. They were heading south toward the convent. Maria realized with horror that this was a special response team, the kind deployed when the Nazis wanted to make an example, when they wanted to send a message. She thought about the other nuns still inside. She thought about the town of Posen. The weight of her decision pressed down like a physical force. She had known there would be consequences. She had accepted that. But knowing and witnessing were different things. The soldiers disappeared down the road. Maria waited until silence returned, then continued north, her heart heavier than before. By the time she reached the abandoned farmhouse, the sun was setting. The sky had turned bruised purple, streaked with orange and red. The farmhouse was exactly as described. A collapsing 2-story structure with caved-in roof and walls blackened by fire, destroyed during the initial invasion in 1939 and left to rot. No one came here anymore. No one except those who needed to disappear. Maria approached cautiously, scanning for signs of ambush. Satisfied she was alone, she slipped inside through a gap in the wall. The interior was dark, smelling of charred wood and decay. Broken furniture lay scattered. Shattered glass crunched beneath her feet. In the far corner, partially hidden beneath a collapsed beam, was a wooden crate. Her heart leapt. The resistance had been here. She pried it open. Inside were supplies: bread, dried meat, a canteen of water, a wool blanket, and a note written in Polish. It read simply, "Stay here until dark. Someone will come. Do not light fire. Do not make noise. Trust no one." Maria sank to the floor, body finally surrendering to exhaustion. She ate bread, drank water, wrapped herself in the blanket. For the first time since that morning, she allowed herself to cry. Not from fear, not from regret, from sheer overwhelming relief. She had done it. She had poisoned 50 SS officers and escaped. The first part of her mission was complete, but she knew the hardest part still lay ahead. She had to survive long enough to tell the world what she had done, and she had to live with the knowledge that she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Outside, darkness fell over occupied Poland. Somewhere to the south, men were dying from her soup. Somewhere closer, soldiers were hunting for the woman responsible. And in an abandoned farmhouse, a nun who had become an executioner waited for deliverance. Maria woke to footsteps crunching through broken glass. Her eyes snapped open, body instantly alert despite exhaustion. The farmhouse was pitch black. She could see nothing but could hear everything. Slow, deliberate footsteps. More than one person. They were inside the building. Her hand reached for something, anything she could use as a weapon. Fingers closed around splintered wood. Pathetic. Useless. But all she had. She pressed against the wall, barely breathing, waiting. Then a voice cut through darkness. A woman's voice speaking Polish with a rural accent. The voice said her name. Not Sister Maria. Her real name. The name she had been born with 52 years ago. Before vows, before becoming a bride of Christ. Maria Antonyina Wyzaka. We are friends. We are here to take you home. The resistance fighters were not what Maria expected. 3 of them. 2 men and 1 woman. None looked like soldiers. The woman was in her 40s, dressed in peasant clothes, face worn and weathered. 1 man was older, perhaps 60, with a limp and scar across his cheek. The other was barely more than a boy, 18 at most, with frightened eyes darting constantly toward the door. They moved with quiet efficiency, checking windows, ensuring no one had followed. The older man introduced himself as Piotr. He explained they were part of a larger network operating in the region since the occupation began. Safe houses scattered throughout the countryside, routes into forests, contacts in cities. Their job was smuggling people out of Poland, Jews, Allied pilots, resistance fighters, and now a nun who had committed one of the most audacious acts of sabotage in the entire war. Piotr told Maria what had happened after she escaped. The SS discovered the bodies within an hour. They sealed the convent and began interrogations. The remaining nuns were questioned for hours but genuinely knew nothing. This saved them from execution. But the town of Posen was not so fortunate. In retaliation for the 47 dead officers, the SS rounded up 200 male civilians from surrounding areas and shot them in the town square. Collective punishment. A tactic designed to discourage further resistance. The message was clear. Kill one of ours, we kill dozens of yours. Maria felt her stomach turn. 200 innocent men, dead because of her. Piotr saw the look on her face. He shook his head firmly. Those deaths are not your fault, he said. They belong to men who created a system where such punishments exist. The officers you killed were responsible for thousands, tens of thousands. If you had done nothing, they would have continued until the very end. Maria was not sure she believed him. She was not sure she could ever believe him. She had always thought of herself as someone who healed, who nurtured, who gave life. Now she was a killer. She had taken 47 lives with her own hands. No matter how justified, she could never undo that fact. It would follow her for the rest of her days. Piotr did not give her time to dwell. They needed to move immediately. The SS was conducting sweeps of every farmhouse, every barn, every abandoned building within 10 kilometers. They were using dogs, informants, collaborators. If Maria stayed longer, she would be caught. If caught, she would be tortured until revealing names of everyone who helped her. Then hanged in a public square, body left to rot as warning. The resistance could not allow that. Not for her sake, for theirs. The plan was simple but dangerous. Travel only at night, moving west through safe houses until reaching front lines. The Red Army advanced from the east. British and Americans pushed from the west. Germany was caught in a vice. The war would end soon. Everyone felt it. But final weeks were often most brutal. Desperate men did desperate things. They had to move Maria through contested territory, through areas where German units retreated in chaos, where order had completely broken down. It would take at least 2 weeks. Every night would be a gamble. Piotr asked if she was ready, if she had strength to continue. Maria looked at this stranger risking his life for hers. She thought about the young woman in the snow, the 47 officers, The 200 civilians? She nodded. She had come this far, sacrificed too much to give up now. She would reach Allied lines. She would survive. She would make sure the world knew what happened. Not for glory. So those deaths would mean something. The journey west became a blur of frozen fields, abandoned villages, and near misses with death. Maria and her 3 protectors moved like ghosts through a landscape shattered by 6 years of war. They traveled only between midnight and dawn, when darkness provided cover but also concealed 1,000 dangers. They slept in root cellars, in attics of sympathetic farmers, in forests so dense that sunlight barely penetrated the canopy. They ate whatever they could find. Stale bread, frozen potatoes dug from abandoned gardens. Once, a thin soup made from melted snow and wild onions. Maria's body, already weakened by years of deprivation at the convent, began to fail. Her feet blistered and bled. Her lungs rattled with every breath. A cough developed that she could not shake, forcing her to muffle the sound with her sleeve whenever they moved through open territory. But she never complained, never asked to stop, because stopping meant dying, and she refused to die before her story was told. The woman, whose name was Christina, walked beside Maria during the most difficult stretches. She held her arm when the terrain grew treacherous, whispered encouragement when Maria's strength faltered. She never asked about the convent, never mentioned the poisoning, but Maria could see respect in her eyes, the kind of respect reserved for those who had crossed a line most people could not even imagine. The young boy, Jakob, served as their scout. He moved ahead of the group, checking roads for patrols, identifying safe passages through the countryside. Despite his youth, he had been doing this work for 3 years. His father had been executed in 1942 for hiding a Jewish family. His mother had died of typhus the following winter. The resistance had become his only family. On the 7th night, they encountered a German patrol. It happened outside a small village whose name Maria never learned. They were crossing an open field, moving in single file, when a flashlight beam swept across the darkness. Someone shouted in German, "Halt!" The fighters reacted instantly. Piotr grabbed Maria and pulled her to the ground. Jakob drew a pistol from his coat. Christina motioned for everyone to stay silent. The patrol consisted of 4 soldiers, all young, all exhausted. Wehrmacht, not SS. Regular army conscripts who wanted nothing more than to survive and go home. They approached cautiously, rifles raised but not aimed. Piotr stood slowly, hands visible, speaking broken German. He claimed to be a farmer returning home with family, visiting relatives, had papers. The soldiers did not believe him. Maria could see it in their eyes. They had heard too many lies. A sergeant with a scar on his chin demanded to see documents. Piotr produced forged papers. The sergeant examined them under his flashlight. He looked at Piotr, at Christina, at Jakob, finally at Maria. His eyes lingered on her face. She looked away, terrified he would see through the disguise, recognize her as the nun from the convent. The sergeant asked her a question in German. She did not understand. Christina quickly intervened, explaining that Maria was deaf and mute. Childhood illness. The sergeant stared at Maria for a long moment. Then he did something unexpected. He handed the papers back and told them to go, quickly, before his commanding officer arrived. Maria did not understand until they were a kilometer away. Piotr explained that the sergeant had seen through their story, but chosen to let them go. It happened sometimes, especially this late in the war. Soldiers tired of killing. Soldiers who no longer believed in the cause. Soldiers who simply wanted the nightmare to end. The sergeant could have arrested them, called for reinforcements. Instead, he gave them a chance. Maria wondered if he knew who she was, if word of the poisoning had spread beyond the SS, if he had looked at her and seen not a fugitive, but a symbol of defiance that even some Germans could respect. She would never know. But for the first time since pouring poison into the soup, she felt something other than guilt. She felt hope. They continued west through the darkness. Behind them, the war raged on. Ahead, the Allied lines drew closer with each passing night. 14 nights remained until freedom, if they survived. By the 14th night, they reached the front lines. The sound of artillery fire rumbled in the distance like thunder that never stopped. The sky glowed orange on the horizon, lit by burning villages and exploding ammunition depots. The landscape had been transformed into something from nightmares. Trees shredded by shrapnel, ground pocked with craters, the smell of smoke and chemicals heavy in the air. The resistance fighters led Maria to the edge of a dense forest where branches hung like broken limbs, and silence felt oppressive. Piotr pointed toward a distant ridge. Beyond that ridge, he said, were British forces. They had advanced rapidly in the past week, holding a defensive line along a river. If Maria could cross the ridge and reach the river, she would be safe. But she would have to go alone. The resistance fighters could not risk crossing into Allied territory. They had work to do, people to save, a country to rebuild. Their war was not ending with Germany's defeat. Poland would need them in whatever came next. Piotr handed Maria a white cloth. "Wave it as you approach British lines," he said. "Shout that you are a refugee, that you are Polish, that you need help." Then he embraced her, brief, awkward, but filled with respect that words could not convey. Christina kissed her cheeks in the Polish fashion, 3 times. Left, right, left. She whispered something Maria could not quite hear. A blessing, perhaps, or a farewell. Jakob simply nodded. His young eyes held the weariness of someone who had seen too much death. He understood what Maria had done, what it had cost her, what it would continue to cost for the rest of her life. Then they disappeared back into the forest, leaving Maria alone at the edge of freedom. She stood there for a long time, staring at the ridge separating her from safety. The white cloth hung limp in her hand. Her legs trembled with exhaustion. Every part of her body screamed for rest. But if she stopped now, if she allowed herself to collapse, she might never rise again. So she began walking, one foot in front of the other. The terrain was brutal, ground churned by tank treads and artillery shells, craters filled with stagnant water, twisted metal jutting from earth like broken bones, and everywhere, terrible silence. No birds, no wind, just distant rumble of guns and wet squelch of her footsteps in mud. Halfway up the ridge, Maria stumbled and fell. Her hands plunged into cold mud. She tried to stand, but her legs would not cooperate. Vision blurred. She realized with detached clarity that she was dying. Her body had reached its limit. 2 weeks of walking through frozen nights, 2 weeks of barely eating, 2 weeks of fear and adrenaline and guilt had drained every reserve. She lay in the mud, staring at gray sky, thinking about the soup, about officers collapsing in the dining hall, about 200 civilians executed in retaliation, about the young German sergeant who let her go, about the woman shot in the snow. All of it swirled together, a tapestry of violence and mercy, sin and salvation. She did not know if what she had done was right. She would never know. But it had been necessary. That would have to be enough. Then she heard voices, English voices. She forced her eyes open. Figures approached, soldiers in khaki uniforms, British troops. They were shouting at her, but she could not make out words. One knelt beside her, checking for wounds. Another spoke into a radio. Maria tried lifting the white cloth, tried waving it, but her arm would not move. The soldier leaning over her said something in English. She shook her head and responded in Polish. "I am a refugee. I need help." Confusion. Questions. But they did not interrogate her. They simply lifted her onto a stretcher and began carrying her down the other side of the ridge, toward Allied lines, toward safety, toward a future she had not allowed herself to imagine. Maria closed her eyes as they carried her. Tears streamed down her mud-caked face, not from pain, not from relief, from the knowledge that against all odds, she had survived. Now she had to learn how to live with what she had done. Maria spent 3 weeks in a British field hospital, recovering from malnutrition, pneumonia, and exposure. The nurses marveled that she had survived at all. Most refugees arriving in her condition did not make it through the first night, but Maria was stubborn. She clung to life with the same determination that had carried her through the drainage tunnel, through the forests, through the frozen fields, and when she was finally strong enough to speak, she told her story. She told it to a British intelligence officer assigned to interview refugees for information about German positions and troop movements. But when Maria described what she had done at the convent, the officer stopped taking notes. He stared at her in disbelief, asked her to repeat herself. She did. He realized he was sitting across from a woman who had single-handedly killed more Nazi officers than some entire resistance cells. The officer wanted to publicize her story immediately. He saw the propaganda value. A nun who poisoned 50 SS officers. The kind of story that could boost morale, inspire resistance movements, demonstrate that even the most unlikely people could strike back against tyranny. But Maria refused. She did not want to be a hero, did not want to be a symbol. She wanted to disappear, to live out remaining days in quiet obscurity, praying for the souls of men she had killed and innocents who had died because of her actions. The officer argued with her, but ultimately he respected her wishes. He filed a classified report detailing her account, stamped it secret and locked it away. And Maria, the woman who had committed one of the most audacious acts of resistance in the entire war, faded into history. Her name appeared in no newspapers. Her face appeared in no photographs. For decades, the world had no idea she had ever existed. After the war ended in May 1945, Maria was offered resettlement in England. The British government had programs for displaced persons, especially those who had aided the Allied cause. She could have started a new life. She declined. Instead, she returned to Poland, not to Posen, which had been devastated by final battles, but to a small convent in the countryside near Lwów. A different order, a different community, but the same rhythms: prayer, work, silence. She took her vows again, reclaiming the identity she had abandoned when she poured poison into that soup. For the next 32 years until her death in 1977 at age 84, Maria lived as she had before the war. She cooked meals, tended gardens, prayed for forgiveness, and she never spoke about what she had done, not to the other nuns, not to priests, not to anyone. The secret died with her, or so everyone thought. In 1991, 16 years after communism fell in Poland, a historian named Dr. Tomasz Lewandowski was researching Nazi war crimes in occupied Poland. He was digging through declassified British intelligence files when he stumbled upon a report dated April 1945. The report described an incident at a convent in Posen, where 47 SS officers had been poisoned by a nun. It included her real name, her age, a brief account of her escape. Dr. Lewandowski was stunned. He had never heard of this incident. It existed in no history books, no archives. He began investigating, tracking down survivors, searching church records, interviewing elderly Poles who had lived through the occupation. Slowly, piece by piece, he reconstructed Maria's story. He published his findings in a Polish historical journal in 1993. The article caused a sensation in Poland but barely made a ripple internationally. The world was focused on other things: the Gulf War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Rwandan genocide. The story of a nun who had poisoned Nazis half a century earlier seemed like ancient history, but history has a way of resurfacing when it is most needed, and Maria's story, buried for so long, finally began to find its audience. Why does Sister Maria's story matter today? In an age where we are constantly told that violence solves nothing, that resistance is futile, that ordinary people cannot make a difference, Maria Antonyina proves otherwise. She was not a soldier, not a spy, not a trained assassin. She was a 52-year-old woman who had spent 3 decades in prayer and service. She had never fired a gun, never thrown a grenade, never raised her voice in anger. And yet, when confronted with absolute evil, she acted. She did not wait for permission, did not wait for orders, did not wait for someone else to save the day. She took the tools she had, a pot of soup and a vial of poison, and struck back. She killed 47 men who had participated in genocide, men who would have continued killing if she had done nothing, men who would have escaped into comfortable obscurity, changing names, hiding pasts, living out their days as respectable citizens while their victims rotted in mass graves. Yes, there were consequences. 200 innocent civilians executed in retaliation. Maria carried that guilt for the rest of her life. Every night in the convent near Lwów, she prayed for their souls alongside the souls of the officers she had killed. But she also carried the knowledge that those 47 officers would never kill again, that families they would have destroyed were spared, that villages they would have burned still stood, that children they would have orphaned grew up with parents who loved them. The reason you have never heard Maria's story is not because it did not happen, It is because it does not fit the narrative. History as taught in schools, as presented in documentaries, as commemorated in monuments, tends to focus on grand moments. D-Day, Pearl Harbor, the fall of Berlin, generals and presidents and treaties signed in palaces. But wars are not won by grand gestures alone. They are won by 1,000 small acts of defiance. A farmer hiding a Jewish family in his barn, a factory worker sabotaging assembly lines, a nun poisoning soup. These stories are harder to tell because they are messy, morally complex. They force us to confront uncomfortable questions about when violence is justified, about what ordinary people are capable of, about the true cost of resistance. So these stories get buried, classified, forgotten, and people like Maria fade into obscurity while history books celebrate men who dropped bombs from 30,000 feet and never saw the faces of those they killed. But Maria saw faces every day for 5 years. She served meals to monsters, listened to their stories, washed their uniforms, and when she finally acted, she did so with full knowledge of what it meant, full awareness of the souls she was sending to judgment, full acceptance of the damnation she might be bringing upon herself. That is not cowardice. That is not fanaticism. That is courage of a kind most people will never understand. Sister Maria Antonyina died in 1977, unknown and unmourned outside the small community of nuns who had no idea of her past. She was buried in a simple grave with a wooden cross bearing only her religious name. But her story survived, locked in a classified file for decades, then unearthed by a historian who recognized its significance. And now it has reached you. So here is the question Maria's life poses to each of us. What would you do if you found yourself serving soup to monsters? Would you keep your head down and survive? Would you tell yourself that resistance was pointless? Would you wait for someone else to act? Or would you become the deliverance you had been praying for? Maria did not wait for a hero. She became one. And the world, whether it acknowledges it or not, is better because she did. Remember her name. Tell her story. Make sure she is not forgotten. Because if we forget people like Sister Maria, we lose something essential. We lose proof that ordinary people, armed with nothing but conviction and courage, can change the course of history, one bowl of soup at a time.